So I know we've been talking a lot about organizational change and the processes that go along with that. I know last week we started to talk about the is and the should. So what the organization currently is doing and what the organization should be doing. So I know when implementing any type of organizational change, organizations typically partner with a consultant, specifically in the operational department that gives advice and gives suggestions related to where the company currently is, where the company needs to be going, and what needs to change in order to meet those goals. So I know that we have goals at the organizational level, the system level, and then like the individual level. And ideally, all of those goals are working together towards one shared purpose. The challenge with things like consultants is kind of the clash when it comes to organizational culture. So what we find is organizations typically have a specific culture, but there's often a disconnect between the exec team and then the people actually within the organization, right? So middle level or lower level management. So the challenge is these consultants are coming in and they're collaborating with the exec board, which makes sense because they are the ones who are making the decisions for the organizations. But the exec team doesn't always have an accurate reflection of what the actual organizational culture is. I know last week we talked about different strategies, well, not last week, the week before, different strategies for maybe getting more insight to the exec team about the culture and kind of what the people are wanting, and maybe giving some type of feedback to the exec team regarding ways to improve and the challenges that their employees are facing. But of course, there's that tension between what actually needs to be done and what is based on rationale and logics and numbers versus what people are feeling, right? So just because members of an organization don't like the changes or don't agree with them or don't feel like they need to be made doesn't necessarily mean that it's not what's best for the organization. So trying to balance the reality versus also keeping your people. And I know there's been a lot of research on driving organizational change. And I know one of the steps, I forgot, his name starts with a K, but I think it's 7 or 8 steps of organizational change. And one of the steps is building a guiding coalition, right? So you want to have people behind you who are going to support you and push this change forward. So when consultants come in and they make a lot of changes too soon, too quickly, you kind of mitigate having that guiding coalition, and now you have more friction and tension versus people who are supporting the change and advocating for the change. So an example is we recently hired, I know I've talked about her last week, but we recently hired a VP of operations in Georgia. And when she first started, she went to all the centers and she had like an hour-long meeting with all the directors and introduced herself and tried to build rapport, which was a great first step. But after that meeting, almost every day, every week, there was some type of task or deadline or change she was trying to make. And it's becoming to the point where it's a lot of friction between her and now leadership, because we feel like you're coming in, you're making all these changes, you're doing all these things, and we're not being heard, and we don't have the relationship or the rapport with you. So I'm actually having a meeting with her on Monday just about kind of what's been going on and the feedback the team has been having, because you haven't adequately built that guiding coalition. So even if what you're doing makes sense and it's for the betterment of the organization, you don't have a strong team behind you willing to support and push the mission forward because you haven't built that relationship yet. And then I know the discussion question I posed was, how can focusing too much on department goals create problems for overall process performance? So overall process performance looks at the overall process, right? The overall organization, the performance of the organization. So each department is naturally going to have their own goals, but if goals aren't inclusive of other departments, then there's going to be discrepancies between those goals, right? So I know in the field of ABA, there's typically operational and then clinical, right? So it is very important for those operational and clinical goals to align in some capacity, because if clinical is pushing for one thing and operations is pushing for another thing, now we have a division and now we're not able to meet the overall processing goal for the organization. Alex also posed a really good question, number 1, basically asking about the timeline for these changes, and he said that it could be very slow. So I think slow is subjective. It really just depends on what changes need to be made and what slow looks like in an organization. Obviously, there's some goals that are urgent that need to be made like within, 30 days, right? And then there's some goals that need to be made within 60 days or 90 days or within the first year. So it really just depends on what that goal is, and then maybe breaking down the process to expedite those goals, or also considering what steps in this process can be altered or shortened, or just we can just do without, right, in order to meet this goal.